It is. We're really excited about the REYES program this summer. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's session, which is Plastics and Microplastics, an Emergent Environmental Issue. And I'm really interested in this myself because I know a little bit about it, but I know I'll learn so much more from our speaker today. So our speaker today is Dr. Fred Dobbs. He is a marine microbial ecologist, serving his 4th year as the chair of the Department of Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences at Old Dominion University. He received his AB in biology with honors from Franklin and Marshall College, his MS zoology from the University of Connecticut, and his PhD in oceanography from Florida State University. Subsequently, he held institutional postdoctoral positions at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and the University of Hawaii. His research on aquatic microbial ecology has focused on bacteria and viruses associated with organic aggregates in the water column, the microbiology of ships' ballast tanks, and the interface of invasion biology and microbiology. Also, his undergraduate and graduate students study bacteria living on plastics in the ocean. He sits on state, national, and international advisory panels and boards. So, Dr. Dobbs, thank you for being here today, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Kara. I appreciate it. Well, I want to welcome everybody who's watching, and let's take a quick overview on plastics and microplastics, an emergent environmental issue. Well, let me first start out by trying to advance the slide, and it's not working. So how do I do that manually? Well, we're having a little bit of a problem here. This worked earlier. There we go. Okay, I figured it out. You think I'm going to talk about plastic pollution? Well, just let me tell you, plastics are wonderful. We can make them in any shape we want. We can make them in any color we want. And ladies and gentlemen, they are cheap. They are so inexpensive to make. We make them all the time. Plastic production has zoomed, as I'll show you later. And in fact, it's anticipated to increase in the future. Plastics are wonderful, yet they really have a bad side. We have a big problem indeed with pollution of plastics in the ocean. And what are these problems? Well, the first is that if you walk on any lovely beach, no matter how isolated, you'll see on the windward side that there's an accumulation of plastic up there on that beach. It's just an aesthetic mess. But there are other issues as well. You may know that these charismatic megafauna, seals and whales, and can be caught up in old fishing gear that's discarded. This is plastic. And turtles who've been eating, in some species, eat zooplankton. They've been eating jellyfish for hundreds of millions of years. They can't tell the difference between a jellyfish and a plastic bag. If they eat that, it goes into their gut and it can kill them. Coral reefs can be impacted by plastic that accumulate on them. And plastic can get onto the propellers of ships, requiring divers to go down and release it. And plastics have even been implicated here, these bottles, in transporting non-indigenous species to parts of the ocean where they normally would not be found. And then there's the problem that the gift that keeps on giving, traps for lobsters or crabs that are down in the bottom, but the surface buoy has been cut. They'll continue to ghost fish, is what we call. So these are some of the issues that plastics impose on us. And it's a problem of global magnitude. Plastic has gone from being a clever invention in an organic chemistry laboratory to ubiquity across the world. The growth of plastics really didn't begin significantly until after World War II, however, but it's continued to the present time, and it's going to continue. In this next slide, I give you an idea. The units here are millions of metric tons, and here we can see that worldwide production of plastic is growing and growing. These are older figures. I don't have any new ones. You can see that the United States has plateaued with respect to that, but demand in other countries, particularly in India and China, has resulted in its going through the roof. In fact, we know that global plastic production all the way back in 2013 was about 300 million tons per year. That's 42 kilograms for every person on Earth. So these plastics are everywhere. What are we using them for? We're using them for a variety of things, and it's mostly packaging, building and construction, and consumer and institutional products. So these institutional products include all the plastic plates and plastic cups that we use in our everyday lives. And it also includes straws. So I'm going to take a little sidebar on straws here. And let's look at straws, at least in the United States. There was an estimate that we're using 500 million straws per day in the United States. That's not a scientific estimate, but it's a guesstimate perhaps. And yet that's only about 1.5 straws per person. So even if it's a little off, we can still do an interesting calculation. What is the volume that would that many straws would occupy in a landfill? So I bought a box of straws from the grocery store and I measured its dimensions. Here you can see those, 576 cubic centimeters, this one box of straws. And then I did a little bit of algebra, cross multiplied, converted cubic centimeters to cubic meters. And the number of straws we're using in the United States every day ends up being a bit more than 7,000 cubic meters per day. How big is that? If we were in the same room, I would have measured the room and told you how many times we could fill the room. But let's use my office, which you can't see, but it's a nice big office. It's about 37 cubic meters. And so every day in the United States, straw consumption is enough to fill my office about 190 times. Now, straws, or at least getting rid of straws, is not going to solve our plastic problem, folks. But I'm just trying to give you an idea of how much plastic is made and used just in the United States every single day. If plastics, a small percentage, is 7,000 cubic meters of waste, think how much all the plastic is if we integrate across all plastics. So people have much smarter than I have actually done this. In a paper by Geyer et al. In Science Advances, we have production, use, and fate of all plastics ever made. And here in this diagram, you see the summary. Primary production of plastics is some 8,300 million metric tons. And of that, we have about 2,500 in use as primary plastics, secondary plastics 100, and recycled is only 600 units, 600 million metric tons. And what has been discarded or incinerated then is the remainder shown here. And so despite all the efforts that have gone into recycling plastics, it's really only about 9% which has been recycled. So we've got nearly 80%, which is accumulated in landfills or in the natural environment. So what's not in a landfill is going to be washed into a river or a stream or a lake, and perhaps eventually goes into the ocean. And indeed, there is a lot of plastic in the ocean. And here we have a guesstimate in a paper by Jembeck et al. That shows the world, and according to color, shows the intensity of plastic waste that's entering the ocean. These are all estimates, but what we can see is that the United States here has between 0.25 and 1 million metric tons of plastic waste available to enter the ocean in 2010. And China and other parts of Southeast Asia and the islands in the southwestern Pacific are seen as hotspots of plastic available to enter the ocean. And indeed, there's an awful lot of plastic that enters the ocean here. I'll talk more about that later. And so we have this situation of a huge waste problem. There's a great amount of plastic that's made. A lot of it, most of it is disposed of. If it's not disposed of properly, it can enter the ocean. And part of the problem is that these plastic products are not biodegradable. And while there is some effort to come up with biodegradable plastics, to a large extent, that's a very, very small percentage. Because they're non-biodegradable, they persist. We know that plastic can remain in the ocean for years. And in some cases, we've got documentation on decades. Some people say that it can last centuries. Well, we haven't done that experiment yet, but perhaps they're right. And so in addition to all the issues that I talked about before, these plastics can serve as a point of absorption for what we call POPs, persistent organic pollutants. Think about DDT or PCBs. And it can also be settlement sites for macro and microorganisms. I'm going to talk to some extent about these issues in succeeding slides. Well, I've been talking about plastics, but I think that microplastics are the issue that most people are worried about. And microplastics are, well, they're micro, except it's a very, very poorly used term in this case. Usage in the literature varies from 0.1 micrometer to up to 10 millimeters, a size range of 5 orders of magnitude. I'm a microbiologist. This allows the use of the prefix micro. At any rate, we see these microplastics, and no matter what their size, coming in really two different kinds of flavors, if you will. The first are primary microplastics, and these are microplastics that are made with a very specific intent of going into a product. And so these are microbeads that you can find in facial cleaners and cosmetics. They're vectors for drugs that are injected into us. They can be used as air blasting media to remove rust, and they can be so-called virgin plastic production pellets. We'll see some pictures of these later and talk more about it in a moment. But the primary microplastics are followed up by secondary microplastics. And these are pieces that have broken off larger plastic objects through physical, biological, or chemical processes. So what do these microplastics look like? Here's an image of some toothpaste, and all those nice little sparklies inside there are microplastics. By the way, this company, Crest, just no longer makes this product, I'm happy to report. Here's another kind of microplastic. These are the pellets that are made. They're quite small. They have the cute little name of Nerdle. Nerdles can be made in any color and with any kind of plastic rosin, and they are then shipped to manufacturing sites where they're melted, formed into, heated such that they're liquefied and then formed into molds to make whatever shape plastic we want. And microplastics can be, in this case, very small. This is a micrograph from a microscope of the fibers that are released whenever we wash our polyester clothes. So our favorite hoodie, for example, would be launching tens of thousands of these each time we do our wash. And finally, and this is from a student's thesis, Amanda Laverty, I'll talk more about her later. These are microplastics that she collected right here from one of our local saltwater rivers with a plankton net. So these are all small. None of them are larger than 5 millimeters, but this gives you an idea about what secondary microplastics look like. They all clearly are a part that is broken off from a larger piece of plastic. So these are some of the ways that microplastics can be found in our environment. This is not a new finding on the part of scientists. Way back in 1972, Ed Carpenter was pulling plankton nets around the Sargasso Sea looking for phytoplankton, and he reported finding plastic particles in that net. And fast forward all the way to 2018, because plastic has been around and going into the ocean in considerable quantities since the end of World War II, we have human footprints in deep parts of the ocean, records of deep sea plastic debris in this article by Chiba et al. And if it's in the ocean, then it invariably gets into fish and bivalves. And so Ruckman et al. In 2015 went to supermarkets and fish stores and found plastic debris and fiber in organisms that are being sold and that we eat. And while I'm an oceanographer and tend to be thinking about the ocean, it turns out that these plastics not only are in the ocean, but they're also in the atmosphere. Allen et al. Last year published in Nature Geoscience a report about all the plastics that they were getting in a remote mountain catchment in the Pyrenees, that mountain range that runs roughly east-west and separates Spain and France. So think of all the plastic bags you might have seen in a tree that's just fluttering in the breeze. Those little pieces of plastic will fall off and are in the atmosphere. And if you take away nothing else from this webinar, please know, and I'm sorry to bring you the news, is that plastics, microplastics, have been found in our tap water, in our sea salt, but ladies and gentlemen, it's also found in our beer. This is one, Kossuth et al. Is one of many studies that have demonstrated that sad fact. So with all these plastics out there, one of the concerns is ingestion. And we know that more than half of the seabird species in the world have ingested plastics. Here you see again some of these plastic production pellets on the left-hand side of your screen. And it turns out that fish eat them too. Way back in the 1970s, Cartar et al. Were looking at fish that in England in the Thames estuary that had ingested plastic pellets. And on the right, you see micrographs of plastic that has been found in the guts of fish from the mesopelagic zone of the ocean. So the mesopelagic zone is 200 to 800 meters deep. 200 to 800 meters deep. That means that these plastic pieces are entering the ocean and sinking down to at least that depth. Well, if they've gone down to 800 meters, they're going to keep going down. And in fact, if we look at the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench in the Pacific, we see that these crustaceans here have inside their guts these fibers. So these fibers, these pieces of plastic, have gone down to depths more than 10,000 meters in the ocean. So plastic in the ocean is ubiquitous, and the really scary thing is that by estimation, most of the plastic that's floating on the surface is at most, I should say, 1% of the plastic that has entered the ocean. So most of the plastic that's in the ocean is below the surface. Now, I've talked about ingestion of plastic, and in fact, if the magic works here, this film will show you some micrographs of crustaceans that are simply in a dish in the laboratory. But if you look inside their guts, you can see that they have taken these styrene beads about 7 to 30 micrometers diameter. They put them into their guts. Here's a close-up now, and because they're fluorescent, you can see the beads traveling down the gut of these organisms. And so while the concentrations are very high here in this demonstration, it shows the potential for these animals to feed on these plastic pieces that are exactly the same size as food they normally feed on. So this disconcerting series of images, you can go to the Plymouth Marine Laboratory and watch more such videos. So I've focused a lot on ingestion, and that's because this great paper by Galloway and Lewis talked about an adverse outcome pathway. And ingestion, which I've circled in red here, is a key part of all this. So ingestion can result in these responses at a subcellular, cellular, individual, and even a population level. Now, let me make very clear, these are hypothetical concerns, but they provide a framework for subsequent observations. So that brings up what I call microplastics unknown number one. What are the effects from the subcellular to the population level of ingesting microplastics? This is a largely unknown part of our world. We know that organisms are ingesting them, but what does that mean? Does that have deleterious effects? There are very, very few scientific reports in this regard. And if I can just jump ahead and say, we know that we humans are ingesting these, but we have no evidence to suggest that there is a harm bestowed upon us from ingesting them. That said, there's very little data on this subject. Now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that have looked at plastics in the environment. And this particular one is from rivers in the northern part of Chesapeake Bay. Old Dominion University is down at the bottom of Chesapeake Bay, but the Yonkos had all reported lots of plastics in the rivers, and no matter when and where they sampled, they found that it was positively correlated with population density. But an important thing is that they were using a screen size of 300 micrometers. They're towing a plankton net to collect these. So 300 micrometers, keep that in mind. If we look at a meta-analysis by Conkle et al., we reviewed 50 such surveys. They found that most of them account for plastics only at 300 micrometers and larger. But they then did some work on their own, and they showed that more than 95% of the particles in shaving cream and body wash and toothpaste, more than 95% of the particles are smaller than 300 micrometers. And so what we're sampling in our efforts to understand microplastics and what actually is in the products that contain the microplastics are really two different sets of sizes. And so this brings up microplastics unknown number two. How can we fully understand this phenomenon when we measure only a fraction of it? How can we manage it if we don't measure all of it? And now I'll take a little time to talk about work done by one of my students, Amanda Laverty. Here are some of the microplastics that she sampled with a plankton net. And her thesis in a nutshell was to collect these microplastics and look at them for bacteria that we know to be pathogenic for humans. And so she was looking not just for their presence, but also their antibiotic resistance. And she also looked at, through DNA analyses, the community composition of all bacteria. And to take her 2 years of work and condense it into one slide, she in fact found these very bad bacteria on them, the first study to do so. And in doing so, she extended earlier reports that had suggested this as a possibility. And she also found that they had antibiotic resistance. And so it might be that marine plastics and microplastics are facilitating gene transfer of antibiotic resistant genes as they float along the surface or sink down to the bottom of the ocean. This paper has just been accepted in PLOS One and should soon be available to you if you want to take a look at it. And so this leads to a very specific microplastics unknown number three. Are we as humans, our health risks increased by ingesting raw oysters and raw clams that have in turn ingested microplastics that have a pathogenic biofilm? This is work that's ongoing in my laboratory now with current graduate students. So I want to turn from plastics in the environment to the politics of plastics. In 2018, China stopped taking plastic from the Western world for recycling, and that caused quite a stir among many countries. Let me show you. Here we can see the many source countries that were sending their plastics to China. But China put a ban on importing these, and as a result, all these countries that you see as lines going to China, so some in South America, Africa, certainly Australia and Europe, as well as North America, have had a deficit to make up. And so the area under the curve in this triangle is a displaced waste that we will have to figure out what to do with. We don't have the facilities existing in the United States right now to handle the amount of plastic waste that we are generating. And that is true of most other countries that were formerly sending their waste to China. So what is the future? Are we going to have an ocean that is filled with plastics, such as this great wave off Kanagawa, a very famous Japanese print, originally without plastic, of course? Is our ocean going to look like this? Well, I'm going to finish by offering a bit of hopeful news, telling you that no, I don't think that's going to be the case at all. And here's why. The solution for this will, I maintain, not be found in governments doing the right thing, or governments setting up plastic recycling. Instead, it is the financial market. I'll call it the market. The market is the one that's going to come to bear. And an example of this is in this company called Closed Loop Partners. You can look it up on the web. And they are thinking about a circular supply chain for plastics as opposed to a single stream one. And so this is a call to action for investors to invest in transformational technologies. This is very inspiring words, right? It will stop plastic waste, keep materials in play, and grow markets. So let me show you a little bit of their propaganda. Here in the topmost, the point is to have a circular supply chain, such that plastics, which used to be produced from oil and petroleum products, I should say, and then used and then become waste, to instead take that waste and cycle it back into various parts of this process. In fact, it's supposed that some of these plastic wastes can be taken back and made into the original monomers from which the plastic polymers were created. And the company Closed Loop Partners maintains that there is a demand for this, and the annual market size is $120 billion, they maintain. That's billion with a B. And so this gets the interest, I hope, of people willing to invest money to make money. This is the financial market. And if you look here at this map of North America, you can see that by virtue of the dots, I'm not going to go into the details here, but the infrastructure exists, Closed Loop Partner maintains, to begin this large-scale transformation of making a circular supply chain for these plastics. And because I am a microbiologist, I will finish with a story about a bacterium. So back in 2014, Yoshida et al. Published an article about this very interesting bacterium that degrades and can assimilate polyethylene terephthalate. This is a plastic that's used in many, many plastic drinking bottles in particular. They found this bacterium, no surprise perhaps, in the ponds of water that were immediately outside of a plastics recycling plant. And so there was just a lot of plastic trash that was in these ponds. And this bacterium was therefore enriched. What this bacterium can do, I'm not going to go into these pathways, with all apologies to the organic chemists listening in, but it can use the PET, the polyethylene terephthalate, as its major energy and carbon source. And so just as the bacterium E. coli uses sugar as its major carbon and energy source, this Ideonella can use PET as its energy source and carbon source. And what's even more remarkable is that it can convert the PET into environmentally benign monomers that other bacteria can then degrade. And so we have the potential for large-scale degradation of polyethylene terephthalate thanks to this wonderful bacterium, I should say. You can follow, they published a paper last year with a follow-up on this. Remember that this is just one, however, one of the many, many polymers that falls under the umbrella of plastics. And so this does not solve the plastics problem completely, but represents a wonderful template for others to come. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, I will conclude the lecture portion of this webinar, and we'll hand over to my host, Carol, and ask her to begin working on the chat session. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and I will forward them to Dr. Dobbs. So Fred, I have a question for you, and it's really about, on the one slide you talked about, possibly eating raw oysters. You're ingesting this plastic, but even if you cook them, you're still ingesting the plastic, right? So you'd still have the same problem whether it's raw or cooked.
Well, that's exactly right. You'd have a problem with the plastic, although I'm not sure that plastic is the issue, and this may simply be the way I view the world. If you cook them, and cook them enough, you would eliminate the pathogens. And so while there are pathogens in oysters independent of plastics, we're asking the question: are there more pathogens in the oysters if they are ingesting plastics? Does that answer your question?
That does, but we're still ingesting the plastic, I think.
We're still ingesting the plastics.
Yeah.
There's a recent study that I just learned about yesterday where somebody was collecting stool samples, that is samples of feces from people around the world. So these were different diets, different people, and all samples were positive for microplastics in their stool. So we are eating this stuff, but I think the evidence at the present is that at least the large pieces are going through us. However, when I've talked with people who study nanomaterials, they're very concerned about the translocation of these plastics from the gut, through the gut epithelium into other parts of our body. That has not been shown in humans. It has been shown in bivalves, and what the ramifications of that translocation are remain to be seen. Carol, if you're sending me any questions, I'm not seeing them.
So rather than put them in the chat, I'm just going to read it to you. So this is from Luis in Hidalgo, Mexico, and he said, "Great presentation. How much does this technology cost in the future if its use is possible?" And he's talking about the bacteria to break down the plastic.
I see. Okay. Buenos días, Luis. Gracias. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm very good at microbiology. I'm lousy as a financial planner or economist. I don't know that, as far as I can tell, this Japanese bacterium, if I back up, as far as I can tell, this bacterium has not been patented. It is not being used commercially, although I can only imagine that the intellectual property rights on this are enormous. So I really don't know how much things would cost. If I back up a little bit more and go to the idea that is put forth by closed loop partners, the investment that needs to be made is considerable. I don't think they're looking for people like me to give them $1,000. They're looking for people to give them hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars to get their projects started. But if the return is $120 billion, then the people who have that sort of money can make it happen. So I really haven't answered your question, but I think that especially if there is money to be made in cleaning up the plastics, that it will happen. Thank you.
So I have another question about the microplastics in cosmetics. So
Yes.
On the labeling of like body wash and face wash, do they actually label it as microplastics, but they don't have the size of them? Is that correct?
The labeling is quite varied, and I have never seen the size. That is correct. If I may follow up, the United States and Canada, I don't know about other countries, but perhaps some in Europe, have passed a so-called microbead free legislation. This happened all the way back, I think, in 2015 or 2016. A large reason for it happening between the U.S. and Canada is because we share the Laurentian Great Lakes. And there's a lot of microbeads. There's a lot of microplastic in the Great Lakes. And yet that micro-free bead legislation does not cover all personal care products, and it certainly doesn't cover other things that have microbeads in them. So it's a start, but it is not comprehensive. You can still buy, as I understand, you can still purchase cosmetic products that have microbeads in them.
So I don't have any other questions in the chat. So if you have a question and haven't sent it, please send it to us. Fred, so I know you, I don't know if you strictly work in microplastics, but when we think about the large patches of plastics in the oceans, so I guess there's concerns there too. Then they carry this same bacteria on them that your student saw in her thesis. Is that correct?
Perhaps. Certainly there are bacteria on the plastics that are floating in the ocean. Especially in the open ocean, there are so few surfaces to which bacteria can attach that if one presents itself, they will do so. So if it's a log or if it's a plastic bottle, they will immediately attach to it. We know from the studies that have been done is that those bacteria that grow on surfaces, whether it's a log or whether it's plastic, are very different from the bacteria that are in the water, that is swimming in the water, free swimming bacteria. So there's actually two communities out there. There's a community of bacteria that's swimming around and will not attach, and then there's a community that's looking desperately to attach to things. So we know that there are two distinct communities. What we don't know, because nobody's looked at it yet, whether the three species that Amanda Laverty found here in our local saltwater rivers are found out in the middle of the ocean. I suspect they might not be, because they like salinity to be a little bit lower as it is near shore, and but that remains to be seen. And if I could follow up, you are, of course, talking about the Great Pacific Plastic Patch, and there are such patches that are named, at least, for other gyre circulations in the ocean. That said, however, with very, very few exceptions that tend to make the press, you would look out and you would not see any plastic. The pieces of plastic are so small and so dilute relative to the great expanse of the ocean that, in fact, you don't see a patch. It's only through sampling that we can know that there's a concentration of plastic there. So it's a bit of a misnomer, in fact, but it really has taken hold in the press because of some atypical and spectacular photos.
So that's interesting, because they talk about cleaning up the plastic patch, and the microplastics we can't clean up. So it is really kind of interesting and quite a dilemma. We do have another question from a student. This is from Jonathan in New York. And he asked, in addition to the harm of ingesting microplastics, has there been research in detecting microplastics or measuring harmful effects in the body, such as the blood or respiratory system?
Thank you, Jonathan, for your question. Let me first make clear that very little is known about harmful effects of ingesting microplastics, and none of it is known with respect to human beings. And this is with reference to the refereed scientific literature. There has not been, to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert in this, but there's been no studies published of effects on microplastics in the blood or in the respiratory system. To get into the blood, whether it's an oyster or whether it's a human, that microplastic, of course, would have to move from the gut into the bloodstream, and that has certainly not been demonstrated for humans. What has happened for oysters has been a demonstrated translocation from the gut to muscle tissue. Again, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. All I'm saying is that there has not been, there's been very, very few rigorous studies in this regard. Thank you for your question.
So we also have a question from Ella, and she's from Franklin, Virginia, and she wanted to know, what are some of the effects of plastics and microplastics in freshwater habitats such as ponds, marshes, and wetlands?
Excellent question, and what it points to, Ella, is the understudied freshwater systems in this regard. So there has been some work in freshwater systems, both in lakes and rivers, but not nearly as much as has happened in the coastal and in the marine environment. I think that the ecological situation would be entirely the same. Perhaps one of the big differences is that it's a lot easier for the plastic to sink down to the bottom of a river, a pond, or even a lake, because most of those are much, much shallower than the average depth of the ocean, which is about 4,000 meters. So I think that there would be faster accumulation of plastics in the sediment in freshwater environments. So there are some papers out there. If you go to Google Scholar and punch in freshwater and plastic pollution, you'll get some idea about it. But if you insert ocean instead of freshwater, there'll be so many hits that the lights will dim as Google Scholar accumulates all the papers that have been published in that regard. Thank you.
So Dr. Dobbs, we would like to thank you very much for your presentation today. There were several responses in the chat just saying what a great presentation it was and that they enjoyed your presentation. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about microplastics.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everyone who tuned in. It was my pleasure indeed.